The perfect beginning. The town of Cedarwood had always been a place where everyone knew each other's name. It was the kind of small, close-knit community where you could leave your doors unlocked and trust that your neighbors would keep an eye on things. The people of Cedarwood were kind, but they were also curious. Nothing went unnoticed here, especially when it came to the two pairs of twins who had been raised as though they were destined to be together. Daniel and David were more than just brothers, they were best friends. As children, they had been inseparable, not only because they shared a birthday but because they shared an innate understanding of each other. Their lives were bound by a common thread, and their bond was something others often marveled at. From their early days of mischief, playing pranks on the local shopkeeper, to the countless hours spent together working on their father's farm, they were always side by side. Despite their deep connection, they were different in many ways. Daniel, with his easy smile and carefree attitude, was the extrovert of the pair. He had a magnetic personality that made him the center of attention wherever he went. People were drawn to his infectious laughter and adventurous spirit. He was the first to suggest a spontaneous trip or challenge a friend to something daring. Daniel lived for the thrill of the moment, constantly seeking new experiences. David, on the other hand, was more reserved. He was introspective, with a quiet wisdom that seemed beyond his years. He spent his days lost in thought, often with a book in hand or working on a project with his hands. Though he was just as kind-hearted as his twin, David had a more cautious approach to life. While Daniel was the dreamer, David was the pragmatist, always thinking things through before acting. The twin sisters, Emma and Ella, were equally as close, but in a different way. Their connection was based on understanding and empathy, as if they could communicate without speaking. From a young age, Emma and Ella had been raised by a family that placed great importance on love and loyalty. Their parents had instilled in them a deep respect for tradition and values, and the girls embraced these teachings with a sense of purpose. Emma, the more fiery of the two, was passionate, energetic, and outspoken. With her bright red hair and an unrelenting spirit, she was often the one to take charge when a situation demanded it. Emma was the kind of person who could inspire others with a single word, and she often found herself rallying people around causes that she cared deeply about. Despite her bold personality, Emma had a soft side, and when it came to those she loved, she was fiercely protective. Ella, in contrast, was more reserved, though no less determined. Her gentle demeanor and thoughtful nature made her the perfect balance to Emma's fiery personality. Ella often acted as the calm in the storm, offering a listening ear and wise advice when needed. Her presence was soothing, and she had a way of seeing through to the heart of any issue. It was rare for her to speak unless she felt it was necessary, but when she did, her words carried weight. People trusted her for her ability to offer perspective, and she had an innate understanding of others' feelings. The four of them had grown up together, neighbors in a town where everyone knew each other's business. They attended the same schools, played in the same parks, and often spent hours after school hanging out by the lake, discussing their hopes and dreams. Their bond was something people admired, and many would say it was no surprise when Daniel and Emma, as well as David and Ella, found themselves drawn to each other in a deeper way as they entered their 20s. Their love stories, though distinct, seemed to follow a similar pattern. Daniel and Emma had always shared a special connection, though it was more playful in the beginning. They would joke around, tease each other, and flirt shamelessly. Their relationship started with a deep friendship that blossomed into something more as they grew older. Emma loved Daniel's sense of adventure, while Daniel found Emma's passion contagious. Together, they were unstoppable. David and Ella, on the other hand, had a quieter love. Their relationship was based on mutual respect and understanding. Where Daniel was bold, David was steady. Where Emma was impulsive, Ella was thoughtful. They complemented each other in a way that made sense to those around them. Their love was calm but powerful, like the steady flow of a river that carved through the landscape without fanfare. Ella had always admired David's quiet strength, while David appreciated Ella's depth and insight. Together, they felt as though they could take on anything. It wasn't long before the inevitable happened. The two sets of twins fell in love, and it felt as though the universe had aligned. Their families rejoiced in the union, and their friends watched in awe as the brothers married the sisters. Cedarwood had never seen such a celebration. The wedding was a grand event, with the entire town coming together to celebrate the twin brothers marrying the twin sisters. It was a day of joy, laughter, and promises for the future. The ceremony was nothing short of magical. The four of them stood at the altar, their hands intertwined, gazing at one another with hearts full of love and hope. The vows they exchanged seemed almost surreal, as though they were pledging their love not only to one another but to the life they had already built together. Daniel and Emma, with their shared sense of humor and adventurous spirit, made promises to always challenge one another and never take life too seriously. They pledged to keep the excitement alive in their relationship, to never stop exploring the world together, and to never let the fire of their love fade. David and Ella, with their quiet strength and deep emotional connection, promised to always support one another through the highs and lows of life. They vowed to remain steady in the face of adversity and to always listen to each other, to communicate openly, and to cherish the quiet moments as much as the grand ones. Their wedding day was the beginning of what felt like the perfect life. Together, the four of them embarked on a new journey, one where love, laughter, and the promise of forever seemed like guarantees. They moved into homes next door to each other, creating a shared space where their families could grow. The community watched in admiration as they navigated married life with grace and joy. The perfect couple dynamic continued for a year, weeks filled with laughter, shared meals, and the joy of growing together. The couple spent weekends together, taking trips to nearby mountains, exploring new restaurants, and enjoying the simplicity of just being in each other's company. Life, at least for now, seemed flawless. Yet, in the shadows of this perfection, there was an unspoken tension, something that, at the time, they couldn't have seen coming. Life in Cedarwood, for all its beauty, could be far too small, too insular, and for all their closeness, the perfect love that they had built was about to be challenged in a way they could never have imagined. The first signs of change. As the months passed, the once idyllic harmony that the brothers and sisters had shared began to show subtle signs of strain. It was not as if a single dramatic event had triggered this shift. No, it was a gradual process, a slow unraveling that none of them had noticed until it was too late. At first, the changes were so small that they could be brushed aside. But eventually, they became too significant to ignore. Daniel, with his adventurous spirit and boundless energy, found himself spending more time away from home. Initially, it was nothing alarming, long hours at the family business, a new project that required his attention, or a spontaneous trip with friends. However, Emma noticed a growing pattern. The late nights, the absences, and the subtle distance in his eyes when he came home were hard to miss. She convinced herself that it was just a phase, that the demands of their growing lives were simply pulling them in different directions. Yet, as the weeks went on, she could no longer deny the gnawing feeling in her chest. Emma's own world had been changing in its own quiet way. Before, she had always been the center of attention, the one who brought energy to every gathering. But now, she found herself often sitting alone, watching as Daniel withdrew into himself. There was a growing space between them that she couldn't quite bridge. She tried to talk to him about it, to tell him how she was feeling, but every time she approached the topic, he dismissed it, assuring her that everything was fine. But the tension between them only deepened. Emma began to question if she was being unreasonable, imagining things in her head. But her heart couldn't lie to her. Something was wrong, and it was eating away at the edges of their once perfect marriage. The same distance had started to creep into David and Ella's relationship, but in a quieter, more subtle way. David, who had always been a man of few words, was becoming more introspective than ever. It was as though his thoughts were locked away in a secret world that Ella could no longer reach. She, too, tried to convince herself that everything was fine, that this was just a temporary phase in their marriage. But Ella wasn't blind. She could feel the change. David no longer seemed fully present when they were together. His eyes, once so full of affection, now seemed distant, lost in thought, perhaps even in regret. Ella often caught herself staring at David as he sat in silence, wondering what was happening to the man she had once married. The man who had been so certain of their love, so willing to share everything, was now a stranger to her. She couldn't understand why he had become so emotionally withdrawn. It wasn't that he was cruel, he never raised his voice or gave her any reason to doubt his character. But there was a coldness in his silence, a heaviness that hung over their home, suffocating the warmth that had once been there. David, meanwhile, was consumed with his own inner conflict. He had always been the quieter of the two brothers, but he had prided himself on his ability to be dependable and steady. Now, however, he felt as though he was losing his grip on everything he had worked so hard to build. The weight of his feelings, the guilt, the confusion, the discontent, was like an invisible burden that he couldn't shake. He had tried to push these feelings aside, to convince himself that they were just a fleeting moment, but every time he looked at Ella, he felt more and more detached from the person he once knew so well. The brothers and sisters, despite the years of shared memories and the deep connection they had always known, now found themselves walking in separate worlds, their hearts divided by unspoken fears. The cracks in their marriages were invisible to the outside world, but to them, they were all too real. It wasn't that they didn't love each other, they did, more than anything. But love, it seemed, wasn't enough to shield them from the growing distance that was spreading between them. One evening, when the air was thick with the humidity of an approaching storm, the four of them gathered for dinner. It was a tradition they had kept ever since their marriages, and they all looked forward to these moments of shared laughter and conversation. But tonight was different. There was a heavy silence at the table, as though they were all afraid to speak the thoughts that loomed in their minds. Daniel barely touched his food, his mind somewhere else. Ella kept looking at David, her gaze filled with a quiet desperation. Emma, her usual sharp wit dulled by the tension in the room, was struggling to find the right words. It was Emma who finally broke the silence, her voice laced with the frustration she had been holding inside. "Daniel, what's going on? You've been distant for weeks now. Are we okay?" she asked, her voice wavering slightly, betraying the fear she had kept hidden. Daniel, caught off guard, looked up from his plate. For a moment, he said nothing, his eyes distant. He opened his mouth as though to speak but hesitated. The truth, it seemed, was harder to face than he had anticipated. After a long pause, he sighed deeply. "I don't know, Em," he finally said, his voice tinged with exhaustion. "I've been working a lot, and things have just gotten complicated." The words hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. Emma felt the sharp sting of disappointment in her chest, but she tried to keep her voice steady. "Complicated? What does that mean, Daniel?" The conversation seemed to fall apart from there, as both brothers looked at their wives with the same mixture of guilt and confusion. The night, once filled with laughter, was now filled with unspoken words and unresolved emotions. The love that had once seemed so certain was now tangled with uncertainty. And as the storm outside finally broke, pouring rain onto the earth, a storm was beginning to brew within their hearts as well. The following days brought no resolution. In fact, the silence between them grew even more oppressive. Daniel threw himself deeper into his work, spending longer hours at the office, while Emma spent her days trying to occupy herself with other tasks, unable to focus on anything with the constant feeling of dread in her chest. She had always been a woman of action, but now, every step she took felt hollow, as though she were walking through her life without truly living it. Ella, too, struggled. She tried to talk to David, but every time she broached the subject, he would retreat even further. He was always polite, always gentle, but the emotional distance between them had grown so vast that even the smallest gesture of affection felt like a distant memory. David knew he was losing Ella, but he couldn't bring himself to admit it, not even to himself. The guilt he felt for allowing the space between them to grow so wide was almost suffocating. Yet, every time he tried to reach out, something stopped him. Was it fear? Regret? Or simply the feeling that the damage had already been done? The couples had found themselves in a place they never thought they would be. The love that had once felt eternal was now fragile, fragile like glass. But what none of them knew was that the unraveling was just beginning. The cracks that had appeared in their marriages were not the end, but the beginning of a journey that would force them all to confront truths they had been avoiding, and ultimately, to ask themselves the most difficult question of all: could their love survive the tests they were about to face? The secret. The moment of truth arrived on an evening that seemed, in hindsight, destined to alter everything. Emma had felt something shifting for months, a growing unease that she could not pinpoint. She tried to brush it off. After all, Daniel had been working long hours, and she had been preoccupied with managing their home. Yet, deep down, she knew. The more time passed, the harder it was to ignore. There was a change in Daniel, a distance in his eyes, a certain coldness in his smile that she hadn't seen before. She knew him well enough to recognize when something wasn't right. On that particular evening, after dinner, Daniel had said he had to stay late at the office. The excuse was familiar enough to not raise alarms, but Emma's gut told her otherwise. She tried to ignore the feeling, but as she cleaned up the kitchen, it gnawed at her. The silence of their home, once comforting, now felt oppressive. The emptiness of their shared space mirrored the void that had slowly crept between them. She couldn't explain why, but on a whim, Emma decided to drive to Daniel's office. It wasn't that she didn't trust him. Rather, it was the inexplicable sense that something had changed, something she couldn't put into words. Her instincts, honed over years of being with him, told her that whatever it was about to surface. As she approached his office, the parking lot was eerily quiet. The dim lights of the building reflected off the wet pavement, and the night air had a damp chill that seemed to match the anxiety that twisted in Emma's chest. She parked her car and, after a moment of hesitation, stepped out, her heart pounding. She tried to reassure herself that she was just being paranoid, but as she approached the entrance, she saw the faint glow of light coming from Daniel's office window. Emma paused. She could see him through the glass. He was sitting at his desk, his back to her, but there was something about the scene that felt off. She couldn't place it. But then, as her eyes adjusted to the dim light, she saw her. The woman sitting across from Daniel. She was young, with dark hair that cascaded in loose waves over her shoulders. She was laughing softly at something Daniel had said, and his response, though not audible from where Emma stood, was accompanied by a smile that was far too intimate, far too familiar. For a moment, Emma stood frozen, her breath catching in her throat. Her heart raced, and her mind screamed for clarity, for some explanation, but none came. She watched as Daniel leaned forward, his body language now suggesting a closeness that she hadn't seen in months, if ever. The woman's hand rested casually on the edge of his desk, and Daniel's gaze lingered on her, his expression unreadable. It was the moment Emma realized that the space between them, between her and Daniel, was not just emotional. It was physical. Her legs suddenly felt weak, and she backed away from the window, not wanting to be seen. She slipped quietly back into her car and drove home in a daze, her mind racing with a million questions she couldn't yet answer. How could he? How long had this been going on? Was she imagining things, or had Daniel been hiding something from her all along? As she pulled into the driveway, the coldness of the night seeped into her bones, and the house, once a sanctuary, now felt like a prison. She didn't know how long she sat in the car, staring at the front door, trying to summon the courage to face whatever awaited her inside. Her thoughts were a whirlwind, and she couldn't stop replaying what she had seen, every smile, every shared glance between Daniel and the woman. The betrayal was not just in what had happened, but in the fact that she had known nothing about it. She had trusted him. She had believed in their love. But now, there was a crack in everything, and Emma didn't know if she could fix it. Inside the house, Ella was waiting for her. The moment Emma walked through the door, she could feel the weight of the air. Ella was standing in the hallway, her expression wary as if she had been waiting for this moment. Ella said softly, her voice filled with concern. You okay? Emma didn't answer right away. Her mind was still reeling, and she could barely process her thoughts, let alone speak them aloud. Instead, she dropped her purse onto the table and collapsed onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. Ella, ever the one to sense when something was wrong, stepped closer, sitting beside her. What happened? The dam inside Emma broke. She told Ella everything. Her voice trembled with emotion as she recounted the moment she had seen Daniel with the woman at the office. The betrayal, the closeness, the laughter, it all came rushing back in a flood of hurt and confusion. Emma couldn't even finish the story before tears began to spill down her cheeks, her hands shaking as she tried to wipe them away. Ella listened in silence, her heart aching for her sister. I don't know what to do, Ella, Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. I don't know who he is anymore. I don't know how to fix this. Ella took her sister's hand in hers, squeezing it gently. She didn't have the answers, but she knew one thing, Emma wasn't alone. They were in this together. And as Emma cried, Ella could feel the weight of her own heart breaking for her sister. She had suspected something was wrong with David, though she had never been able to pinpoint exactly what it was. The change in him had been gradual, but it had been there. But now, knowing what Emma was going through, Ella couldn't help but wonder if she had been blind to her own situation. Was David hiding something from her too? After a long silence, Emma looked up at her sister, her eyes red and puffy. Ella, what if Daniel has been seeing her for months? What if he's been lying to me this whole time? Ella shook her head, not knowing how to answer. I don't know, Em. But we need to talk to them. We need to know the truth. If they're hiding something, we deserve to know what it is. The truth was, neither of them had any idea how much this conversation would change everything. The next day, Emma and Ella decided it was time to confront their husbands. It wasn't easy, and they had no idea what to expect, but they knew one thing, the secrets that had been hiding in the shadows could no longer remain there. The weight of the truth, once out in the open, would either tear them apart or bring them back together. The crossroads. The day after the confrontation was like stepping into a storm, though the air outside was unnervingly still. It was as though the entire world had paused, holding its breath in anticipation of what would come next. Emma and Ella, each carrying the weight of the secrets they had uncovered, had agreed that they would not wait any longer. They would confront their husbands, even if it meant risking everything they had built. The truth, they realized, was more important than maintaining the illusion of peace. The decision. The following weeks were a blur of confusion, emotional exhaustion, and a kind of silent waiting. Time, once so fluid and comfortable, now felt like a burden. The couples, though still living under the same roof, had retreated into their own worlds. They ate their meals in silence, avoided eye contact, and spent hours in their respective corners of the house, processing everything that had been laid bare. The truth, once spoken, couldn't be taken back. Emma found herself trapped in a whirlwind of thoughts, constantly torn between the love she had for Daniel and the betrayal she felt. She had always believed that love, when nurtured and cared for, could withstand anything. Yet, here she was, questioning whether love alone was enough to overcome the cracks that had formed between them. She had loved Daniel with everything she had, with all her heart. But now, she was no longer sure if that was enough to heal the wounds. Could she truly forgive him? Could their marriage survive the destruction of trust? The questions echoed in her mind day and night, leaving her with a deep sense of uncertainty. Emma spent hours walking around their home, trying to figure out where they had gone wrong. Their love had once been so simple, so pure. But now, the weight of the deceit hung heavy in the air, and every corner of their home seemed to whisper of the lies that had been told. The comfortable silence they had once shared now felt suffocating. The once familiar walls of their house felt like a maze, and Emma wasn't sure if she wanted to find a way out or if she was simply too afraid to face the reality of what lay ahead. Daniel, for his part, was consumed by guilt. He had been a fool, he knew that now. The woman at his office had been a distraction, a way to escape the pressures of his own mind. He had never meant for it to go so far. But it had. And now, the woman he had loved for so many years, the woman he had built a life with, was looking at him as if she didn't know him. How could he explain the damage he had caused? How could he make it right? The answer seemed just out of reach, a tantalizing mirage that he couldn't quite grasp. He had apologized 1,000 times, but nothing seemed to ease the pain in Emma's eyes. Nothing seemed to erase the betrayal he had caused. And so, he found himself sitting alone in their shared bedroom, staring at the empty space next to him. He had always found comfort in the thought of Emma beside him, of sharing his life with her. But now, the space between them felt vast, and no words he could say seemed to bridge the gap. David, too, was struggling. In many ways, he felt like he had been running from himself for years. The emotional distance he had created between himself and Ella hadn't been a conscious choice, it had been the result of his own internal conflict. He had once been sure of his love for her, sure that their connection was unbreakable. But as the months passed, he began to feel a disconnect, a feeling that he couldn't explain. And instead of facing it head-on, he retreated further into his own thoughts, afraid to confront the reality that he was no longer sure of himself, let alone their marriage. Ella had always been his rock. She had supported him through everything, standing by his side without question. Yet, as much as he loved her, he couldn't seem to shake the growing feeling that something was missing. He had tried to suppress it, to convince himself that it was just a phase, but deep down, he knew it wasn't. And now, after everything that had happened, he was left questioning whether he could ever truly give Ella the love she deserved. He had hurt her in ways he never thought possible, and now, standing on the precipice of their future, he wasn't sure what to do next. Ella, meanwhile, was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. She loved David. She had always loved him. But now, her heart was heavy with the weight of his silence, the silence that had grown between them for so long. She couldn't understand it. How had they gone from being so in tune with one another to this painful, emotional distance? She had always trusted David, but now, that trust felt fragile, as though it could shatter at any moment. She found herself questioning everything, their relationship, their future, her own feelings. Could she ever truly forgive him for the distance he had placed between them? Could she rebuild the trust they had lost? And if she could, what would that look like? Ella had always been the one to offer advice, to offer support, but now, she was at a loss. She didn't know what the right choice was anymore. Her heart ached for the man she had married, but her head told her that something had changed, something that couldn't easily be undone. The couples, though still living in the same house, had begun to drift further apart. Their once joyful home was now filled with silence, a silence that spoke louder than any argument ever could. They had reached a crossroads, and each of them knew that something had to change. But what? It was during one particularly quiet evening that the decision was made. Emma and Ella, after days of soul-searching, came to a mutual understanding. They would no longer pretend that everything was fine. They couldn't ignore the reality of what had happened. They couldn't pretend that the emotional distance between them was just a phase. They had been given a harsh truth, and now, they had to decide what to do with it. That night, the four of them gathered together, the air thick with tension. There were no more words left to hide behind. No more excuses. No more pretending. They had all made mistakes, and they had all been hurt in ways they could not have imagined. But now, it was time to face the future. Emma was the first to speak. "I don't know what comes next," she said softly, her voice trembling but resolute. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Daniel. I don't know if I can go back to the way things were. But I do know that I'm not ready to give up on us yet." Daniel's heart skipped a beat, and he looked at Emma with a mixture of relief and apprehension. "I'll do whatever it takes," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "I'll prove to you every day that I can be the man you deserve. I made a mistake, but I'll fight for us. I will." Ella, looking at David with the same mixture of sadness and love, spoke next. "I've spent so much time trying to understand why things have changed, trying to make sense of it all," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "And I think I'm ready to give us a chance. But only if we both commit to being honest. No more hiding. No more running away." David nodded, his eyes filled with both gratitude and fear. "I don't want to lose you, Ella. I know I've hurt you, and I don't know if I deserve a second chance, but I will do whatever it takes to prove that I'm worthy of your trust." The silence that followed was heavy, but not oppressive. It was a silence filled with the understanding that their journey was far from over. There was no magic moment when everything was fixed. There was no easy resolution. But there was hope that with time, with effort, they could rebuild what had been broken. And so, they made a decision, not one of certainty, but one of possibility. They would take time. They would be patient with one another, and they would face their fears, their insecurities, and their doubts head-on. It wouldn't be easy, but they were willing to try. The decision, though small in the grand scheme of things, was a turning point. It was the beginning of a long, uncertain journey. They had to learn to trust again, to communicate openly, and to rebuild the foundations of their relationships. The road ahead was unclear, and the future was uncertain. But for the first time in weeks, they felt a flicker of hope. They didn't know what would happen next, but they knew one thing: they were not ready to give up. Not yet. And for now, that was enough. Emma had barely slept the night before. Her mind was in turmoil, the image of Daniel with the woman from his office burned into her memory. She had tossed and turned, feeling betrayed not just by the actions she had seen but by the silence and distance that had been growing between them for months. The emotional isolation she had felt, the subtle withdrawal of affection, it all made sense now. The lies, whether explicit or unspoken, were too great to ignore. That afternoon, after much deliberation, the four of them gathered at the house, once again, that familiar space that had been filled with laughter, love, and shared moments of joy. Now, it seemed like a hollow shell, echoing with the tension and weight of what was to come. When Daniel and David entered the room, both of them seemed hesitant, as if they knew what was coming but weren't quite ready to face it. Daniel's usually confident stride was now slower, his shoulders hunched slightly, as if preparing for a blow. David, who had always been more reserved, wore an expression of quiet anxiety, his eyes darting between the two women, unsure of where to look or what to say. Emma, her heart racing, stood as they entered. The words she had rehearsed in her mind no longer seemed enough. How could she capture the hurt, the betrayal, the confusion that had taken root in her heart? She had always been able to express herself, but now, her voice seemed inadequate to convey the depth of her emotions. "Daniel," Emma's voice broke the silence, sharp and raw. "How long?" Daniel swallowed hard, looking at her with a mix of guilt and regret. "Emma, please." "No," she cut him off, her voice trembling but steady. "Don't you dare try to make this about me or your job or anything else. I saw you with her. You've been lying to me, and I deserve to know the truth. How long have you been seeing her? Daniel opened his mouth, but no words came out. He looked at Ella, then back at Emma, his face pale. He had always been good at hiding his emotions, but in this moment, his guilt was painfully evident. His hands trembled slightly as he ran them through his hair. I didn't mean for it to happen, Daniel finally said, his voice quiet, barely above a whisper. It wasn't intentional. I swear, I didn't want to hurt you. Emma's chest tightened, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She had heard the words before, the "I didn't mean to hurt you" and the "it just happened" excuses, but none of them made the pain go away. None of them could undo what had already been done. No, Daniel, Emma said, her voice growing more firm, though the tears were threatening to spill. You chose to be with her. Every moment you spent with her, every time you lied to me, you made a choice. You made a choice to betray me. David, standing just a few feet away, shifted uncomfortably, his eyes avoiding Emma's gaze. His lips were pressed into a thin line, as though he was bracing himself for something even worse. Ella, feeling the tension thickening in the room, turned to David, her voice trembling with emotion. And what about you, David? She asked, her voice quiet but laced with hurt. What's been going on with you? You've been distant. You've been pulling away from me. Was I not enough for you, too? David's head snapped up, his eyes wide with the sudden realization that Ella knew. His heart raced as the truth hit him in waves. The guilt he had been carrying for months now came crashing down on him. He had thought he could keep it hidden, that he could suppress his emotions, but there was no escaping it now. Ella's face was full of sadness, full of confusion, and he had no answers to offer her. I didn't want this to happen, David said, his voice cracking as he spoke. Ella, I didn't know how to talk to you about it. I've been struggling with myself. I didn't want to hurt you. But I've been pulling away. And I don't know why. Ella felt her heart break all over again. Her thoughts scrambled, but one question kept repeating itself in her mind: what do we do now? The room was silent for a moment, each of them caught in their own thoughts, feeling the weight of their own mistakes and the deep ache of betrayal that had settled between them. There was no easy way out. No simple solution to fix the tangled web they had woven. Finally, it was Emma who spoke again, her voice calmer now, but no less filled with pain. I don't know what we're supposed to do now. I don't know if I can forgive you, Daniel. And I don't know if I even want to try. Daniel's face crumpled, his eyes brimming with tears as he struggled to find the right words. I love you, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I never wanted this. I've been so lost in my own head, I didn't see what I was doing to us. I'm sorry. I will fix this. I swear, I will. Emma shook her head, her emotions rising up like a tidal wave. I don't even know who you are anymore. I thought I knew you, Daniel. I thought we were everything. Ella, her own heart aching for her sister, turned to David. Her eyes were full of pain, but they also carried a quiet determination. And what about you, David? What does this mean for us? Can we move forward from here? Or is this just a part of you now? David opened his mouth, then closed it again. He didn't have an answer. The words were stuck in his throat. He loved Ella, of that he was sure. But the distance between them had become so vast that he didn't know how to bridge the gap. He didn't know if it could be fixed, and the fear that gripped him only made it worse. The couples were at a crossroads. Both women were filled with hurt and doubt. Their hearts longed for clarity, for a resolution, but there was none to be had. They were left with the bitter reality that love, no matter how strong it had once been, could not simply erase the damage that had been done. What do we do now? Emma whispered, looking at her sister with tear-filled eyes. I don't know, Ella replied softly. But we need to decide. We need to decide if we can heal, if we can trust again. Because if we can't, we'll lose each other forever. The room was thick with silence. There was no easy way forward, no simple fix for the pain they were all feeling. Each of them was left to face their own truth, their own feelings of betrayal, and the uncertain future that stretched out before them. Could their marriages survive this? Or had they reached the point of no return? The truth was, none of them knew. They had to choose what mattered most, to fight for love or to walk away from everything they had once believed in.